The crown was on her pillow when she woke. Harriet Dunvale stared at it. A circlet of hammered gold inlaid with chips of dark garnet, resting against the linen like it belonged there. Like someone had placed it carefully, deliberately, while she slept. She didn't scream, didn't gasp. She sat up in the narrow cot of her borrowed room in the Highland keep, her ash-blonde hair falling across her forehead in sleep-tangled layers, and she looked at the crown, the way a farmer looks at a fox in the henhouse, with absolute furious stillness. She knew who had left it. There was only one person in this keep who would dare: Torsten Ashgrove, the Alpha King. The man who had arrived at her family's farmstead 6 days ago with a company of 20 riders and a declaration that had turned her life inside out. He'd walked through the barley field, the barley she'd planted, tended, and harvested for 3 seasons running, and told her father that his daughter had been chosen, not asked, not invited. Chosen. Her father had wept with joy. Her mother had pressed both hands to her mouth and whispered prayers to every ancestor she could name. And Harriet had stood in the doorway of the farmhouse with dirt under her nails and chaff in her hair, and stared at the Alpha King, tall, dark-haired, wearing a slate-blue tunic like he'd dressed for a walk in the fields rather than a royal decree, and said, very clearly, no. He'd blinked, just once. Then he'd tilted his head, the copper wolf-tooth torque at his throat catching the late afternoon light, and said, all right. That should have been the end of it. It wasn't. She picked up the crown with 2 fingers, the way she'd pick up a snake she wasn't sure was venomous, and carried it downstairs. The Highland keep was modest compared to the southern palaces. Stone walls darkened by centuries of peat smoke, narrow corridors that funneled the mountain wind into a constant low whistle. She'd been here 3 days. 3 days since Torsten had suggested, as though she had a genuine choice, that she spend a fortnight at the keep before making her final decision. You've never seen where I live, he'd said, standing in her father's kitchen with his warm cedar eyes watching her with a patience that made her want to throw something. Come, look, decide for yourself, and if you still say no at the end of it, I'll ride home alone. She'd agreed only because her mother had given her a look that could have wilted stone. And because, though she would sooner eat her own boots than admit it, something had shifted in her chest when he'd walked through her barley field. A sharpening, like every compass needle in the world had stuttered and swung toward a new north, and that north was 6 feet tall and smelled like wood smoke and clean linen. She'd been ignoring it for 6 days. She was very good at ignoring things. The great hall was empty at this hour. Dawn light came through the eastern windows in pale columns, catching the dust motes that drifted through the cold air. Harriet crossed the flagstones in her bare feet, the hem of her cream cotton shirt brushing her thighs, and set the crown on the long oak table with a deliberate clank. Not interested, she said to the empty room. She turned to leave and nearly walked into him. Torsten stood in the doorway, the actual doorway, as though he'd been leaning against the frame waiting for her. His deep black hair was damp from washing, cropped close at the sides, the textured top falling slightly forward over his brow. He wore his usual slate-blue linen tunic, the sleeves rolled to his elbows, and moss-green canvas trousers tucked into weathered tan boots. No crown. He never wore one himself, which Harriet found either humble or deeply hypocritical, and she hadn't decided which. His gaze dropped to the circlet on the table, then back to her face. Morning, he said. I'm returning that. I can see. I don't want it. Noted. He stepped aside to let her pass. As she did, her shoulder nearly grazed his chest, and the sharpening returned with a vengeance. The grain of the stone beneath her feet, the exact direction of the wind through the corridor, the precise distance between her body and his. 7 inches. No. 6. Her skin prickled with awareness, and her pulse kicked once, hard against her throat. She kept walking, didn't look back. Behind her, she heard him pick up the crown. He didn't say anything else. Harriet spent the morning doing what she always did when she didn't know what to feel. She worked. The keep's kitchen garden was a disaster. Whoever had been tending it had planted the rosemary too close to the mint, let the kale bolt past saving, and allowed bindweed to strangle half the root vegetables. It was the kind of neglect that made Harriet's fingers itch. She found a pair of worn gloves in the potting shed, pulled on her tobacco-brown suede jerkin over her cream shirt, and got on her knees in the dirt. This, she understood. Soil had rules. You put seeds in, you watered them. You pulled what didn't belong. Nothing surprised you. Nothing arrived on your pillow uninvited. She was elbow-deep in tangled bindweed, her dark plum breeches already muddy at the knees, when a shadow fell across the bed. "You're fixing my garden," Torsten said. Not a question. Someone had to. She didn't look up. "Your kale is finished. The bolting's too far gone. But if I cut back the rosemary and move the mint to the south wall, you'll have a decent herb patch by midsummer. Your chervil's got a fighting chance if I thin the bed today." A pause. She could feel him watching her, that steady, unhurried attention that made her skin prickle, like standing in a field before a thunderstorm when the air goes dense and electric. "Do you want help? Do you know the difference between dill and fennel?" Another pause. "No." Then no. She heard what might have been a laugh, low, contained, more breath than sound, and then the shadow moved away. When she finally glanced over her shoulder, he was gone. But on the stone wall beside the potting shed, where she'd left her brass compass pendant on its cord while she worked, someone had placed a cup of tea, still steaming. Beside it, a heel of dark bread with butter. She ate both. She wasn't a fool. The crown was on her pillow again. Same position, same careful placement against the linen, the garnets catching the first gray light through the window. As though it had grown there overnight, like something seated in the dark. Harriet sat up, pressed both palms against her face, and breathed out slowly through her fingers. She counted to 10. Then she counted to 20, because 10 wasn't enough. She dressed, jerkin, breeches, boots, and carried the crown downstairs. This time, she didn't leave it on the table. She walked through the great hall, through the corridor, through the heavy oak door that led to the courtyard, and across the cobblestones to the well. She set the crown on the edge of the well wall, balanced precisely on the stone lip, and walked away. Let him find it there. Let him wonder. She was halfway across the courtyard when his voice reached her from somewhere above. A window, she realized. Second floor. The study she'd been avoiding because she'd caught a glimpse of his desk through the open door, and it was covered in maps. And maps made her think of territory, and territory made her think of kingdoms, and kingdoms made her think of crowns. "Bold choice," he called down. She stopped, looked up. He was leaning on the windowsill, arms crossed, the early light catching the copper torque at his throat. His expression was perfectly neutral, but his eyes, those warm cedar eyes, held something that might have been amusement or might have been admiration. She couldn't tell from this distance, and she didn't want to get close enough to find out. "It's a well," she called back. "Things fall into wells." "Is that a threat to my crown? It's a statement of physics." That, almost laugh again. She could see his mouth shift. Not quite a smile, but the architecture of one. The scaffolding. "I'll keep that in mind." She went to the kitchen garden and pulled weeds until her shoulders ached, and she'd stopped thinking about the way his voice sounded from above, warm and unhurried, like he had all the time in the world and intended to spend it exactly where she was. The thing about Torsten Ashgrove, the thing that made him dangerous in a way Harriet couldn't defend against, was that he didn't push. He didn't follow her around the keep. didn't corner her with declarations or grand gestures or speeches about destiny. He simply existed in the same spaces she did, at the same hours, and when their paths crossed, he treated her like someone whose opinion mattered more than her title ever would. Not like a prize, not like a reluctant bride, like a person he was genuinely, quietly curious about. It was infuriating. It was the most disarming thing anyone had ever done to her. She discovered this over the course of the second day, when a heavy rain drove her indoors and she found herself in the keep's library. A small room with deep-set windows and shelves lined with books that smelled of damp leather and old ink. She'd pulled down a volume on highland soil composition because even in a king's library she was still herself, and was 3 chapters in when Torsten appeared in the doorway. He didn't come in, just stood there, holding 2 bowls of stew and a torn half-loaf of bread tucked under his arm. "Kitchen sent these up," he said. "Thought you might be hungry." She was. She'd skipped breakfast in her hurry to deposit the crown at the well. "You can come in," she said, and immediately regretted the softness in her own voice. He sat across from her at the reading table. They ate in silence for a while. A silence that should have been awkward, but somehow wasn't. The rain hammered against the windows. The fire in the grate popped and settled. And that sharpening sensation returned, quieter this time, gentler, like a compass needle trembling toward north and holding steady. She could feel the exact distance between his hand and hers on the table surface. 7 inches, maybe 8. The wood grain between them was old oak, polished by generations of elbows. "Can I ask you something?" she said. "Always." "Why me?" He set down his spoon, looked at her, really looked, in that way that made her feel both seen and exposed, like someone had pulled back a curtain she didn't know was there. "I visited 18 farmsteads on my way north," he said. "At every one, people bowed. They offered their best food, their finest rooms, their daughters in silk they couldn't afford." He paused. The fire cracked. "At yours, a woman standing in a barley field told me I was standing on her seedlings." Harriet felt her face heat. "You were." "I was." His warm cedar eyes held hers, and the steadiness in them was like bedrock. Immovable, patient, old. "And you were the first person in 200 miles who cared more about her barley than my title. That's not a small thing, Harriet. That's the thing." She didn't know what to say to that, so she looked back down at her book, and he let her, and they sat together while the rain poured and the fire burned low, and neither of them mentioned the crown sitting on the well wall in the courtyard, collecting rainwater in its garnet-studded bowl. That night, she couldn't sleep. She lay in her narrow cot and stared at the ceiling and thought about the life she'd built. Not inherited, built. The farmstead. The soil under her nails. The rhythm of seasons that asked nothing of her except attention and care. Planting, tending, harvesting, resting. A cycle as old as the hills and just as reliable. A life that was small and complete and entirely hers. And then she thought about what a crown meant. Councils and ceremonies, and receiving halls full of strangers. People watching, always watching. Decisions that rippled outward and affected thousands of lives she'd never touch. A life that would never be small again. A life that would never be just hers. She pressed her palm flat against her sternum, where something hummed faintly. Not painful, not unpleasant, just present. The compass bond. She'd been trying to ignore it for days, the way it oriented her body toward his without permission, the way she always knew which direction he was in. Right now, he was below her, and to the west. The study. Still awake. She hated it. She hated that her own instincts were making a decision her mind hadn't agreed to. She hated that her body knew what it wanted before she'd given it leave. She turned onto her side, closed her eyes, and tried very hard to think about Cale. The crown was on her pillow. Of course it was. This time, there was a note beneath it. A single line, written in a hand that was steady and unadorned, with no flourish, no seal, no royal insignia. Take your time. Harriet held the note for a long moment, read it again, and again. 3 words that asked for nothing and offered everything. Patience without pressure, space without abandonment. 3 words that understood her better than any declaration could have. Then she held the crown. She'd been picking it up and putting it down for 3 days, but she'd never actually held it properly. Never let her fingers trace the hammered ridges. Never felt the smooth garnet chips set flush into the band. Never noticed the way the gold was warm even when the room was cold, as though it held its own heat. It was beautiful. And it terrified her. She got dressed. Dark plum breeches, cream shirt, the tobacco-brown jerkin with its familiar worn softness, and laced her black boots. She hung the brass compass pendant around her neck. She picked up the crown, and she went to find him. He was on the ridgeline trail. She'd known he would be. Not because anyone had told her, not because she'd checked, but because the bond had pulled her east the moment she'd stepped outside, and she'd followed it without thinking. Up the rocky path behind the keep, through the sparse highland grass that crunched with early frost, to the ridge where the land dropped away and the morning spread out below in layers of mist and stone and pale gold light. Torsten stood at the edge, his back to her, looking out over the valley. The wind caught his tunic and pressed it against his shoulders. He looked, for a moment, like someone carrying a weight he'd stopped noticing. Not because it had gotten lighter, but because he'd gotten stronger. She walked up beside him, held out the crown. 3rd time, she said. He looked at it, then at her. 3rd time. You keep putting it on my pillow. You keep bringing it back. Because I don't want it. He turned to face her fully. The wind pushed her cropped hair across her forehead, and she shoved it back impatiently. His eyes tracked the movement with a flicker of something soft, something unguarded, then returned to hers. What do you want, Harriet? The question hit her somewhere below the sternum. Not because it was aggressive or demanding, but because it was genuine. He actually wanted to know. He was standing on a windswept ridge at dawn, the valley spread behind him like a kingdom he'd set aside, asking a farmer's daughter what she wanted, as though her answer was the only thing in the world that mattered. I want my life to stay mine, she said. The words came out rougher than she intended, scraped raw by something she hadn't prepared for. I want to plant things and watch them grow. I want dirt under my nails and quiet mornings and no one looking at me like I'm supposed to be something I never asked to become. He nodded slowly. His expression didn't change. No hurt, no frustration, no impatience. Just that steady attention, like stone. And you think the crown takes all of that away? Doesn't it? It doesn't have to. She laughed, short, disbelieving. You're the alpha king. Your mate becomes queen. Queens don't kneel in kitchen gardens pulling bindweed. Mine would. 2 words, spoken quietly, without drama or declaration or any of the grandness she'd braced for. And yet they landed in Harriet's chest like a stone dropped into still water, the ripples spreading outward, touching everything, reaching places she'd thought she'd walled off years ago. She stared at him. The wind howled between them. The compass bond surged. Not pulling, not demanding, just orienting, settling, like a needle that had finally stopped spinning and found the place it was always meant to point. You don't even know me, she whispered. I know you fixed a garden no one asked you to fix, he said. I know you read soil composition manuals for pleasure. I know you threatened to drop my crown down a well, and I believe you would have done it. His mouth shifted. That almost smile, the one she'd started looking for without meaning to, the one that rearranged his entire face and made the Alpha King look like a man standing in a field. hoping. I know enough, and I'd like to know the rest, but only if you'd like me to. The crown was heavy in her hands, gold and garnet and centuries of meaning she hadn't earned and wasn't sure she could carry. She held it out to him. He didn't take it. I'm not ready, she said. I know. He reached out, slowly, giving her every chance to step back, and closed her fingers around the crown with both of his hands. His palms were warm, rougher than she'd expected for a king, calloused in ways that spoke of reins and sword hilts and work he didn't delegate. When his skin touched hers, the world sharpened so intensely that she could feel the individual blades of grass beneath her boots, the exact temperature of the wind, the direction of every path on the ridge, and every room in the keep below. Keep it, he said, not as an answer, just as a possibility. She looked down at their joined hands around the crown, looked up at his face, the patience in it, the steadiness, the complete absence of pressure or expectation. You're very annoying, she said, so I've been told. She kept the crown, not on her head. In the bottom drawer of the chest in her room, beneath a folded wool blanket where she wouldn't have to look at it but where she'd know it was there. She didn't give it back, and they both knew what that meant, and neither of them said it. The days shifted after that, not dramatically. Torsten didn't suddenly appear at her side or press for more than she offered, but the spaces between them grew smaller, by inches, by degrees, like plants growing toward the same light. She found herself eating meals in the great hall instead of carrying plates to the garden. Found herself walking the ridgeline trail in the evenings and not being surprised when he fell into step beside her, matching her pace, exactly. They talked. Really talked. Not about crowns or kingdoms or bonds, but about the things that lived underneath those words. He told her about the loneliness of command, how every room he walked into went quiet, how people performed versions of themselves for his benefit until he'd forgotten what honesty looked like. She told him about the year the frost came early and took everything, every seedling, every hope her parents had planted that spring, and how she'd walked the ruined rows at dawn and started replanting before the ice had even fully melted. That's why the crown frightens you, he said one evening. They were sitting on the low stone wall behind the keep, overlooking the valley. The sun was setting in layers of amber and rust, and the air smelled of cold earth and the rosemary she'd transplanted that morning. You've built your life from bare ground, piece by piece, with your own hands, and you're afraid that if you put on a crown, all of that building becomes someone else's story. She pulled her knees to her chest. The brass compass pendant shifted against her collarbone. Wasn't it always? She asked quietly. Isn't that what mates are? My life folded into yours? No. He said it simply, firmly, without hesitation. That's what bad kings do. I've seen it. I refuse to be it. He looked at her, and in the fading light his warm cedar eyes were darker, deeper, the color of turned earth after rain. I'm not asking you to give up what you've built, Harriet. I'm asking you to build something new, with me, side by side, your rose and mine. The compass bond hummed between them, not a pull, but a resonance, two needles pointing the same direction. She didn't answer, but she didn't leave, either. And when the sun dropped behind the ridge and the stars emerged one by one over the highland dark, she stayed on the wall beside him until the cold drove them both indoors, their shoulders nearly touching, the distance between them no wider than a breath. At the door to her room, she stopped. Torsten. He paused in the corridor, half turned, the torchlight catching the copper torque at his throat and the patient question in his eyes. She crossed the distance between them in 2 steps, rose onto her toes, and kissed him. It wasn't tentative. It wasn't careful. It was the way she did everything, direct, whole, and without apology. Her hands found the front of his tunic, the rough linen bunching beneath her fingers. His hands came up, one at her waist, warm and steadying, one cradling the back of her head, his fingers threading into the short hair at her nape, and he kissed her back with a gentleness that undid her more than any urgency could have. Slow, thorough, like she was something worth taking time with. The compass bond locked into place, not a click, not a snap, a settling. Deep and quiet and permanent, like roots finding water, like a foundation being laid. The world didn't sharpen this time. It softened. Every direction became the right one because they were all the same. Toward him, toward her, toward the place they stood together. She pulled back. His forehead rested against hers. His breathing was uneven, and she found she liked that. Liked knowing she'd disrupted the immovable calm of the Alpha King, liked the slight tremble in the fingers still tangled in her hair. "That's not a yes," she said. "I know. It's a maybe. I'll take a maybe." His thumb traced a slow line along her jaw, and his voice was rough at the edges, stripped of its usual composure. "I'll take whatever you give me, Harriet. For as long as it takes." She stepped back, went into her room, closed the door, and stood there with her back against it, her heart hammering, her compass settled and sure, feeling for the first time like maybe. The crown in the bottom drawer wasn't a cage. Maybe it was a door. 3 months later, the Highland keep looked different in autumn. The sparse grasses on the ridgeline had turned gold, and the kitchen garden, Harriet's kitchen garden, because everyone in the keep called it that now, including the king, was thick with late-season sage and thyme, and the last stubborn carrots clinging to the cold soil. She'd expanded it twice since midsummer, adding raised beds along the south wall and a cold frame for winter greens that she'd designed herself and talked the keep's carpenter into building. She knelt in the dirt in her familiar tobacco-brown jerkin, sleeves rolled past her elbows, her brass compass pendant swinging with each movement. The soil was cold beneath her fingers. The wind carried the sharp scent of frost and wood smoke down from the ridge, and somewhere in the keep behind her, she could hear the faint sound of voices. The morning council she was technically supposed to attend, but had traded for an hour in the garden. Because Torsten understood, because he always understood, she was happy. She was still getting used to that. The way it sat in her chest like a second heartbeat, quiet and constant and earned. The keep had changed around her too. Not its bones. Those were centuries old and immovable, like the man who lived in them. But its rhythm. Torsten had cleared a workroom for her next to the library, with a long table for seed catalogs and planting charts, and the soil composition manuals she kept ordering from the capital. He'd had a proper potting shed built along the garden's west edge, with ventilation and tool storage and a cast-iron wood stove for the coldest months. He'd assigned 2 groundskeepers to learn from her, not as servants, but as students. He'd given her a life that was still hers, just bigger, just shared. She finished banking the rosemary bed, stripped off her gloves, and went inside to wash. In their room, and the word still sent warmth through her like sunlight through glass. She splashed water on her face and pushed her ash-blonde hair back from her forehead. The crown sat on the dresser, not in the bottom drawer, not hidden beneath a blanket, just resting there in the open, next to her compass pendant and a jar of dried lavender she'd harvested from the garden in late summer. She picked it up, same weight, same hammered gold, same garnet chips catching the autumn light through the window. But it felt different now. Not like a burden, not like a cage, not like someone else's expectation pressed against her skull. It felt like hers, like something she'd grown into, the way a vine grows into a trellis. Not because it's forced to, but because the structure was there when it was ready. She set it on her head. It fit perfectly. It had always fit perfectly, which she suspected Torsten had known from the very beginning, and the patience required to wait for her to discover that on her own was either maddening or the most loving thing anyone had ever done for her. She decided it was both. She looked at herself in the small mirror above the wash basin. A farmer's daughter in a dirt-streaked jerkin and dark plum breeches, with a golden crown on her cropped ash-blonde hair and soil still under her fingernails. It should have looked ridiculous. It didn't. It looked like someone who'd chosen, freely, fully, on her own terms, to be exactly where she was. A creak from the doorway. She turned. Torsten leaned against the frame, the same way he'd leaned against the great hall doorway that first morning, arms easy at his sides, watching her with those warm cedar eyes. His gaze moved from the crown to her face, and the expression that crossed his features was something she'd never seen from him before. Not triumph. Not satisfaction. Not even that almost smile she'd learned to read like weather. Relief. As though he'd been holding his breath for 3 months and had only just now remembered to let it go. She waited for him to say something. A declaration. A claim. Something grand and kingly and befitting the moment. He smiled. Just that. A real, full, unhidden smile. The first one she'd ever seen that wasn't scaffolding, wasn't architecture. It reached his eyes and lived there, warm and steady and completely unguarded. And it changed his entire face into something she wanted to look at for the rest of her life. "Took you long enough," she said. "I had good advice." His voice was rough at the edges. "Someone told me to take my time." She crossed the room. He straightened from the doorframe and met her halfway. Hands at her waist, forehead against hers, the compass bond humming between them like a song they'd finally learned the words to. "It suits you," he murmured against her hair. "The crown?" "All of it." She pressed her face into his chest and breathed him in, wood smoke and clean linen and the copper-warm scent of the torque at his throat. Outside, the highland wind moved through the keep's corridors like a long exhalation, and the garden she'd planted waited under the autumn sky with its roots deep in soil she'd turned with her own hands. She smiled against his heartbeat, not because she'd surrendered, not because she'd been convinced or persuaded or worn down, because she'd finally understood that choosing someone wasn't the same as losing yourself, that putting on a crown didn't mean taking off everything else, that the bravest thing a woman who'd built her life from bare ground could do was let someone build beside her. And Harriet Dunvale had always been good with seeds.